At my dad's 60th birthday, he raised a glass and said, "Everything here exists because of me, and when I'm gone, it all goes to your sister." My sister smirked. I just sat there and nodded, because what none of them knew was that I bought the house 5 years ago. The business is in my name. The cars? Registered to my LLC. And that night, I left a folder on the table titled, Updated Ownership Records. I, 32M, sat at the head table watching my father's 60th birthday party unfold like a stage play I'd been forced to attend. The backyard looked pristine under the string lights I'd paid to have installed 2 weeks earlier. About 40 guests mingled around the pool, their laughter floating up into the cool evening air. My father stood near the outdoor bar, scotch in hand, surrounded by his usual audience of admirers. My sister stood beside him in a designer dress I knew cost more than most people's monthly rent, her smile sharp and satisfied. The house behind us glowed warm and inviting. 5 bedrooms, 4 baths, sitting on 2 acres of prime real estate. Everyone here thought it was my father's crowning achievement, the symbol of his success. They were wrong. I knew exactly whose name appeared on the deed, and it wasn't his. My father clinked his glass with a knife, and the crowd quieted. He loved moments like these, when all eyes turned to him. I watched from my seat, my face carefully neutral, as he cleared his throat and began to speak. He thanked everyone for coming, made a few jokes that landed well enough, and then his expression shifted into something more serious. He started talking about legacy, about what he'd built over his lifetime, about how he'd started with nothing and created an empire through sheer determination and hard work. I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my expression blank. The crowd murmured appreciatively, hanging on his every word. Then he gestured broadly at the house, at the property, at the 3 luxury cars parked in the driveway. He said all of this existed because of him. Every brick, every dollar, every success. The crowd applauded. My mother stood beside him beaming, her hand on his arm. My sister's smirk grew wider. That's when he said it. When he was gone, everything would go to my sister. She would inherit the house, the business, everything he'd worked for. Because she understood what family meant. Because she'd always been there for him. Because she deserved it. My sister actually laughed, a delighted sound that carried across the suddenly silent crowd. People glanced at me, probably expecting some reaction. I simply nodded, raised my glass slightly in acknowledgement, and took a sip of my water. My father seemed momentarily thrown by my lack of response, but he recovered quickly and wrapped up his speech to renewed applause. What none of them knew was that I'd spent the last 5 years systematically ensuring that everything they thought was his was actually mine. The story starts long before that birthday party. It starts 7 years ago when my father's business hit a rough patch, and he came to me for help. I was 25 then, fresh off a successful exit from a tech startup I'd co-founded. I had money, and he had debts he couldn't cover. Banks wouldn't touch him. His credit was destroyed from years of poor decisions and gambling problems nobody wanted to acknowledge publicly. He asked me for a loan, $50,000 to keep the business afloat. I gave it to him, no questions asked, because that's what family does. 6 months later, he needed more. Then more again. Each time he promised to pay me back. Each time my sister would call me and say I should help out more, that I was being selfish with my money while they struggled. Never mind that my sister had never worked a day in her life. Never mind that she spent money like water while contributing nothing. She was the favorite, always had been. The golden child who could do no wrong. I was the backup, the one who existed to serve and support and then fade into the background. After 2 years of loans that were never repaid, I got smart. My father needed a major cash infusion. The business was drowning. The house was 3 months behind on mortgage payments. Creditors were circling. He came to me desperate, and this time I saw an opportunity. I told him I'd invest, but only if we restructured everything properly. I brought in lawyers and accountants. We set up an LLC. I became the primary investor and controlling partner. The business got transferred into the new entity. My father remained as CEO and title, but I held the actual power. He was grateful, relieved to be saved from ruin. He signed everything I put in front of him without really reading it. My sister called it a betrayal. She said I was taking advantage of our father's difficult situation. I reminded her that I was the only one with money to invest, and that investment required protection. She stopped speaking to me for 6 months. The house came next. 2 years ago, the bank finally moved to foreclose. My father had borrowed against it repeatedly over the years, taking out equity to fund his lifestyle and my sister's spending habits. When the payment notices started arriving, he panicked. My mother cried. My sister blamed me for not helping sooner. I bought the house outright through my LLC, paid off the mortgage, settled with the bank, and took possession of the deed. My parents could live there rent-free as long as they wanted, I told them. I drew up a rental agreement that gave them lifetime occupancy at zero cost. My father didn't even read it. He just thanked me effusively and told everyone I'd helped him refinance at a better rate. My sister never knew. Neither did my mother. They thought the crisis had been averted through my father's financial maneuvering. I didn't correct them. The cars came last year. My father's Mercedes, my mother's BMW, and the Range Rover my sister drove like it was hers. All leased in my father's name, all draining money every month. When the leases came up for renewal, I bought them out and registered them to my LLC. My father thought I'd co-signed for him. My sister thought they were still his. Nobody asked to see the actual paperwork. I'd spent 5 years quietly acquiring everything while they spent and borrowed, and assumed the gravy train would never end. I'd done it carefully, methodically, with legal documentation for every transaction. And I'd done it while being treated like the lesser child, the one who existed to serve the family's needs without receiving recognition or respect. So when my father stood up at his birthday party and declared that everything would go to my sister, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Let him promise her the world. Let her smirk and gloat. They had no idea they were celebrating over assets they didn't own. I stayed at the party for another hour, making small talk with relatives who barely knew me and business associates who'd never taken me seriously. My sister held court like a princess, already planning how she'd redecorate the house when it became hers. My father accepted congratulations on his success, his legacy, his carefully constructed empire. When the party finally wound down and most guests had left, I went inside to use the bathroom. The house was quiet, most people still outside enjoying the cool night air. I'd brought a folder with me, kept it in my car until this moment. I retrieved it and brought it inside. The dining room table was covered with birthday cards and gifts. I cleared a small space in the center and placed the folder down. It was a simple manila folder, unremarkable except for the label I'd printed and affixed to the tab. Updated ownership records. Inside were copies of every deed, every title, every registration, every LLC document. The house, the business, the cars, everything they thought belonged to my father, laid out in clear legal terminology showing that I was the actual owner. I'd included a cover letter explaining that while I'd allowed them to use these assets, ownership had transferred to me over the past 5 years in exchange for the hundreds of thousands of dollars I'd invested to save them from financial ruin. I didn't leave it there out of spite, though I won't pretend that wasn't part of it. I left it because they needed to know, because my father couldn't leave my sister something that wasn't his to give, because eventually they'd try to execute whatever plans they were making, and the truth would come out anyway. I was just controlling the timeline. I walked back outside, said my goodbyes, and drove home. My phone stayed silent that night. I figured they hadn't found the folder yet, or if they had, they were too shocked to respond. The next morning my phone exploded. Update 1. My mother called first, her voice shaking. She asked if what she'd read was true, if I really owned the house they lived in. I confirmed that yes, I'd purchased it 2 years ago when the bank was about to foreclose. She went silent for a long moment, then asked why I hadn't told them. I reminded her that I had told them I'd handled the mortgage situation, and they'd chosen not to ask for details. She started crying, saying she felt betrayed, that I'd taken advantage of their trust. I stayed calm and walked her through the timeline. The mounting debts, the desperate calls for money, the loans I'd given that were never repaid, the crisis points where I'd been the only one willing and able to help. She didn't have much to say to that. My father called next, and he wasn't crying. He was angry. He accused me of scheming behind his back, of stealing his legacy, of being a snake who'd waited for his moment of weakness. I let him vent for a while, then asked him a simple question. Did he remember signing the LLC documents? Did he remember signing the deed transfer paperwork? Did he remember asking me for help when he had no other options? He blustered that he hadn't understood what he was signing, that I'd deliberately confused him, that I'd taken advantage of an old man. I was 25 when this started, I reminded him. He was 53, hardly old, and the documents were reviewed by his own lawyer, who he'd insisted on having present. He'd signed willingly because he'd needed the money and I'd been his only option. The call ended with him telling me I was no longer his son. My sister's call came last, and it was the most predictable. She screamed that I'd ruined everything, that I'd stolen her inheritance, that I was pathetic and vindictive and bitter. I let her wear herself out, then calmly explained that there was no inheritance to steal. Everything she thought existed was actually debt that I'd paid off with my money. Without my intervention 5 years ago, the house would have been foreclosed, the business would have collapsed, and they'd all have been left with nothing. She told me she'd sue. I told her to go ahead, that every transaction was documented and legal, and that suing me would require money for lawyers that she didn't have. She hung up on me. The rest of my family started taking sides. Some relatives called to tell me I'd gone too far. That family doesn't treat family this way. Others quietly reached out to say they'd always suspected my father was financially irresponsible and I'd probably save them from worse. My sister's friends started posting vague social media messages about betrayal and snakes in the grass. I stayed off social media entirely. For 3 weeks, I heard nothing directly from my parents or sister. Then my father's lawyer called. He wanted to discuss the situation and explore options for transferring assets back to my father. I told him there were no options to explore. The assets were mine, legally purchased, and properly documented. If my father wanted to contest the transactions, he was welcome to try, but he'd signed everything willingly and with legal counsel present. The lawyer admitted that from a legal standpoint, my position was solid. He asked if I was willing to negotiate some kind of arrangement. I asked what he had in mind. He suggested I could sell the house back to my parents at a favorable price or transfer the business back into my father's name with appropriate compensation. I declined. The assets would remain mine. That's when things got nasty. Update 2. My sister started a campaign to turn the extended family against me. She told everyone I'd manipulated and stolen from our elderly parents, conveniently leaving out the part where I'd saved them from financial ruin. She posted long, tearful messages on social media about how money changes people and family means nothing to some individuals. Her friends rallied around her. People who barely knew the situation sent me messages calling me greedy and heartless. I didn't defend myself publicly. The people who mattered knew the truth. The ones making judgments based on my sister's version of events weren't people I cared about impressing. My mother tried a different approach. She called and asked if we could have coffee, just the two of us. I agreed. We met at a cafe near her favorite shopping area, and she spent an hour trying to appeal to my emotions. She talked about family bonds and forgiveness. She said my father was proud, even if he couldn't admit it, and that I'd humiliated him in front of everyone. She asked if I was really going to let our family fall apart over money. I told her this wasn't about money. It was about respect. For 5 years, I'd been treated like an ATM machine that existed to solve their problems while being excluded from any real recognition or appreciation. I'd invested hundreds of thousands of dollars, saved them from bankruptcy and homelessness, and the thanks I got was being written out of the inheritance in favor of my sister, who'd contributed nothing but demands for more. My mother said that wasn't fair, that they'd always loved both of us equally. I asked her when was the last time my father had introduced me as his successful son. When had he ever bragged about my accomplishments the way he constantly bragged about my sister's meaningless social achievements? When had either of them acknowledged that everything they had was still theirs only because of my money? She didn't have good answers. She left the cafe in tears. 3 months after the birthday party, my father had a health scare. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough for a hospital stay. My mother called me from the emergency room. Her voice panicked, asking me to come. I was in a meeting 2 hours away. I told her I'd get there when I could. By the time I arrived, he was stable and resting. My sister was there, playing the devoted daughter for the nurses. My mother looked exhausted. I spoke with the doctors, got the full situation, and made sure he was getting proper care. My father barely acknowledged my presence. Over the next week while he recovered, I visited regularly, brought him books and magazines, talked to his doctors about treatment plans, made sure my mother was eating and resting. My sister showed up for visiting hours when there were other people around to see her being supportive, then disappeared. One afternoon when we were alone, my father finally spoke to me. He said he'd had time to think while lying in that hospital bed. He understood now what I'd done and why. He didn't like it, but he understood. He asked if we could find a way forward. I asked him what kind of way forward he had in mind. He said maybe I could put the house back in his name, and we could work out some kind of arrangement for the business. I asked him why I would do that. He said because he was my father and he'd made mistakes, but family should forgive. I told him I'd forgiven him years ago for all the ways he'd made me feel less than. For every time he'd praised my sister while ignoring my achievements. For every time he'd asked for money while treating me like an obligation rather than a son. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean giving back assets I'd legally purchased with my own money to save his reckless spending. He got angry then, said I was holding the past over his head, that I'd never let him move on. I reminded him that at his birthday party just months ago, he'd announced to 40 people that I deserved nothing, that everything would go to my sister because she was the only one who mattered. Those weren't ancient grudges. That was his truth spoken freely when he thought he held all the power. I left the hospital before the conversation could deteriorate further. Update 3. 6 months after the birthday party, things reached a breaking point. My sister got married to her longtime boyfriend in an elaborate ceremony that cost a fortune. My parents paid for most of it. Money they didn't really have, but insisted on spending to keep up appearances. I wasn't invited to the wedding. My mother called me the week before, crying, saying that my sister had insisted I not be included because my presence would upset people. My mother wanted me to know she'd fought for me to be invited, but my sister had been immovable. I told my mother I understood and wished her well at the ceremony. What I didn't tell her was that I'd been expecting this. My sister had been looking for a way to publicly exclude me, to make a statement about whose side the family was on. The wedding was her perfect opportunity. 2 weeks after the wedding, my father's business had a major contract fall through. The client had been his largest account, representing about 40% of revenue. Without that income, the business was in trouble again. My father called me for the first time in months, his voice subdued, asking if we could talk about business. We met at his office. He looked older than he had at his birthday party, more tired. He explained the situation with the lost contract and the financial implications. He needed an emergency cash infusion to cover payroll and expenses until he could replace the revenue. He was asking me, as the majority owner of the LLC, to invest more capital into the business. I asked him how much he needed. He said at least $80,000 to get through the next quarter. I asked him what his plan was for replacing the lost revenue. He laid out a strategy that sounded optimistic but feasible. I told him I'd think about it. 3 days later, I gave him my answer. I would invest the money, but the terms were changing. I was tired of being a silent partner while he made decisions that affected assets I owned. Going forward, I would take an active role in business operations. Major decisions would require my approval. He would report to me on financial performance monthly, and he would publicly acknowledge to clients and employees that I was the owner and he worked for me. My father's face went red. He said I was humiliating him, trying to destroy what he'd built. I reminded him that what he'd built had nearly destroyed him, and that I'd rebuilt it with my money. If he wanted my continued investment, these were the terms. If he didn't, he was welcome to find funding elsewhere. He took the deal. He had no other choice. The announcement to staff happened the following Monday. My father introduced me as the owner and majority stakeholder of the company. Some employees seemed surprised. Others, particularly the ones who'd been around long enough to know the financial history, just nodded like pieces were falling into place. I gave a brief speech about continuity and stability and my commitment to the business's success. My sister heard about it through the family grapevine and lost her mind. She called me screaming that I was destroying our father, that I was publicly humiliating him to feed my own ego. I told her that our father had publicly humiliated me at his birthday party by announcing I was worth nothing compared to her. This was just reality catching up with perception. She said I was bitter and petty. I said she was probably right, then hung up. My mother tried one more time to mediate. She invited me to lunch and spent 2 hours trying to find some middle ground where everyone could be happy. Could I give my father back some dignity in the business? Could I transfer the house back so they felt secure? Could I at least pretend things were the way they used to be for the sake of family harmony? I asked her why the burden of maintaining family harmony always fell on me. Why was I always the one expected to give more, sacrifice more, accept less? Why had my father's public declaration that I deserved nothing been acceptable, but my revealing the truth about who owned what was a bridge too far? She didn't have a good answer for that either. A year after the birthday party, we've settled into a new normal. My parents live in the house I own, rent-free as agreed. My father runs the business day-to-day, but but reports to me and requires my approval for major decisions. My sister is married and living in a condo her husband bought, no longer expecting inheritances that don't exist. We don't speak. Extended family has mostly stopped taking sides. The drama has faded into family history, just another story about how money and pride can tear people apart. Some relatives still think I went too far. Others quietly tell me I did what I had to do. I won't pretend I don't have regrets. I regret that it came to this. I regret that my father's pride and my sister's entitlement made it impossible to have an honest relationship. I regret that my mother got caught in the middle of something she didn't create. But I don't regret protecting my investments or establishing clear ownership of assets I purchased. The truth is, my father was right about one thing at his birthday party. Everything that exists now exists because of someone's hard work and sacrifice. He just got the person wrong. It wasn't his success that built what they have. It was my money, invested strategically over 5 years to save them from the consequences of their own financial irresponsibility. My sister smirked that night because she thought she'd won. She thought the golden child was finally getting her reward while the backup son got nothing. What she didn't understand was that I'd already won years earlier. I just hadn't felt the need to announce it. That folder I left on the table wasn't revenge. It was a correction, a statement of fact that they'd all chosen to ignore because it was more comfortable to pretend things were the way they'd always been. But financial reality doesn't care about comfort or tradition or which child was always the favorite. Sometimes I wonder if I should have handled it differently, been more confrontational earlier or more secretive throughout. But ultimately, I did what I thought was right at each decision point. I helped when asked. I protected my investments. I documented everything. And when my father publicly declared I deserved nothing, I simply revealed that the something he was giving away wasn't his to give. People say blood is thicker than water. What they forget is that respect and appreciation matter more than shared DNA. My father had decades to treat me like I mattered. He chose differently. That choice had consequences. I'm just the one who enforced them. The house still stands on its 2 acres, beautiful under the string lights that glow every evening. The business still operates, more stable now with proper financial oversight. The cars still run smoothly. Everything looks the same from the outside. Only now, everyone knows who actually owns it all. And my father has to live every day with the reality that his declaration of my worthlessness became the moment his illusion of control shattered completely. I drive by sometimes, late at night, and look at the house glowing warm against the dark sky. My parents inside, living in comfort I provided. The life they almost lost, preserved by money they didn't earn. And I feel something complicated. Not quite satisfaction, not quite regret. Just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the only way to be seen is to stop letting people pretend you're invisible. Even if the cost is a family that will never quite forgive you for refusing to disappear.